perhaps a few more people who will be joining us. But welcome to the webinar sponsored by Iowa SOPI. The topic is the gut microbiome and human health. How do we promote gut health? This webinar is designated for one CHES credit, which is sponsored by the National Commission for Health Education Credentialing. So you can, if you're CHES eligible, you can receive up to one continuing ed contact hour for this webinar today. The cost is free for Iowa SOPI members, and for non-Iowa SOPI members, the cost is only $10. We did have some issues with our payment on our website, but that problem has been fixed now, so you can go ahead and make your payment if you haven't already. I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Depken. Dr. Depken is currently an associate professor in the School of Health, Recreation, and Community Services at the University of Northern Iowa. She received her doctoral degree from Temple University in the area of health promotion with an emphasis on gender and health. She also completed postgraduate work in epidemiology at the University of Buffalo. In addition to her teaching interests related to gender, stress, and nutrition, Dr. Depken is currently immersed in the rapidly expanding research on human microbiomes and their impact on health. Additional research and community service interests include measurement, theory, and applied programming related to the social determinants of health, including gender, food access issues, and stress well-being linkages. Her research interests include gender, nutrition, health and well-being, social and cultural determinants of health and well-being. And her teaching interests are food and nutrition, women's health, stress and well-being, and health determinants. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Depken, and I'll turn it over to you at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gail, and thank you, Tiffany, for organizing this event. I was fascinated with the microbiome issues when I started avid gardening a few years ago, in terms of buying a small orchard, actually, with blueberries and asparagus and apples. And the soil was fairly dead, as it was a conventionally grown orchard, and no worms, no life. So I started with soil and soil health, and then grew out from there. I've got a couple of, all right, we're not forwarding here. One second. Wrong one. 1 second, and we will biota from PubMed. And you can see that after 2012, when the Human Microbiome Project started and revealed some of its findings, it's been astronomical. Before this time, you had to take bacteria out of a test tube or into a test tube and then try to predict interactions. And what we know now is that we have more biota, bacteria, on and in our bodies than we do human cells. We have about 10 pounds of biota that we carry with us and that are crucial for our development, immune system, fighting inflammation, disease, everything that you can think of. So we're going to kind of walk through some of the basics and cut through some of the jargon as we go. So
I hate to interrupt, but we're not seeing your slides at this time.
Oh, did you see them before? Thank you for clarifying that. So let's just go back to the slide with, this is the astronomical increase in publications in PubMed regarding human microbiome or human microbiota. And I'm inserting here just some screenshots of pieces of research that I thought were relevant to the specific topic. And that is that most of the scientists and researchers who are on the frontiers of this themselves are saying it is forcing us all to look at things in a different way. And it is a systems analysis way and not a mechanistic way. So it is exciting on their end also. So these are the topics. Some of them I will try to keep myself on time, and some of them you can refer back to, like the snapshots of the research. So, basics of the human microbiome. As I said in the beginning, I started with a deep dive into how to restore the soil that I'm growing my food in. And the microbiome in the soil is, again, a complex and rich understanding of how the plants get nutrition. And I started on feeding the root systems and feeding the fungi and adding to the biota of the soils to have them harvest the nutrients that they need. But a biome is a community of microorganisms, including bacteria, fungi, and viruses that inhabit a particular environment. And this is a biome environment. So my blueberries have a different biome than my asparagus, and they need a different biome. So our gut is a different biome than our mouth or our skin. And so the microbiome can be applied to any different small unit. So Merriam-Webster says it's the collective genomes of microorganisms inhabiting a particular environment, especially we're applying it often to the human body. And human microbiome would refer to microorganisms on the body, but as we'll see later, there are many different biomes on our body and in our body. So microbiota and microbiome are often used interchangeably, but when we talk about the biome, we're talking about the whole microbial community. The microbiota is talking about the community members. And although we tend to focus on bacteria, because that was initially what the Human Microbiome Project looked at, there are many different other forms of fungi, archaea, and eukarya that inhabit our body. So those things are wild cards, and there are experts that are trying to untangle how they interact. So the gut has about 4 pounds worth of microbes on average. We need them, and we will talk more about different types and how we influence them. But it is really clear, initially there's some argument about this, but microbial cells outnumber human cells in and on our body about 10 to 1. So we have to look at ourselves as a symbiotic unit rather than, and this is ancient, and this is true for most animals, or mammals at least. So microbiota defines this population. The bacteria tends to be the focus of a lot of the current research. And the bacteria that we have, oral cavity, esophagus, stomach, colon, vagina, skin, nostril, hair, all have unique microbiomes that have been characterized in terms of groupings of bacteria. In the gastrointestinal tract, what we call the gut microbiome, there are bacteria, viruses, and protozoa, and fungi, and archaea. And each part of our intestinal tract is characterized differently. And most of the focus tends to be on the large intestine. And the large intestine is the one that does a lot of the fermentation and a lot of the stuff that can really help us stay healthy. So this is just a slide that looks at the microbiome project. The important piece here for most of us is you'll see this term metagenomics bantered around a lot. And that is, in a petri dish or in a test tube, you cannot duplicate the interactions that are happening because they are so complex and interrelated. So metagenomics is their ability to take snapshots of what is currently occurring from environmental samples or fecal samples, and they can characterize the big picture. They don't always know exactly how that big picture works, and they are ironing out a lot of those things. Okay, so another interesting thing from the Microbiome Project is that they can map genetically like a fingerprint. If they can take these snapshots, they can identify a lot about where you've been, what you've eaten, and who you are. And a lot of this is based on some earlier twin studies. And twins and people who grow up together have similar biomes, especially in their gut, while they are cohabitating, but then they branch out, and it is definitely fluid depending on many different factors, including what we eat. So it's often called the second brain because we now know that there is fairly direct communication between our gut and our brain. We know that our gut microbiome helps with immune regulation. We know that it absolutely is necessary to absorb certain vitamins and minerals and nutrients. We know that appetite and satiety or fullness is very directly related to our gut microbiome and the bacteria. There's a burgeoning amount of research on mood and food, or food as it impacts our gut microbiota and affects our mood states. And that's rapidly evolving, but I think it's promising that we used to say exercise is great for depression, and I believe in the future we're going to say food is just as important as exercise in mood and pain control. So this is broad and it is big. The difficult part or the challenging part here is that there are so many different microbes that interact with each other as well as with our body in different ways through different chemical, amino acid, different communication pathways. It is a vast opening for exploration, and I'm thankful that there's a lot of science out there, but there's no way that I can keep up with it, let alone any practitioner can keep up with it. So I will stay very humble and say this will change rapidly, and I'm just giving you a snapshot at this current time and place. So complex and dynamic symbiosis. Some of these biota have been with us for a very, very, very long time. And some of them we have even integrated into our cells. So it is complex. So I'm trying to keep it to what is practical. All right, there is, I want to say robust, but robust body of literature means that there's numerous studies that validate it. Instead, we're at the frontiers of serious research that is suggesting a relationship between the gut microbiome, or dysbiosis, which is when it dysregulates, and autism, asthma, obesity and metabolic syndrome, liver disease, cancers. Specifically, there is a robust body of literature on colorectal cancer, which is kind of obvious. And there's more coming out too. Diabetes mellitus, stroke. So when we talk about this gut-brain, it's often called the gut-brain axis. And there are various ways that there's signaling and transfer of information and regulation taking place. From our perspective at this point in time, if you understand the gut-brain axis and that it affects neurotransmitters, proteins or neuropeptides, immune system signaling. Short chain fatty acids, we will talk a little bit more later, but that is the foodstuffs for our gut biota that's crucial and related to what we eat. And the mucus in the gut is absolutely a crucial communication pathway. They communicate through the mucus, and we need a good, healthy mucus for them to communicate well with the rest of our body. So translated, this gut-brain axis influences weight gain. How, primarily when we talk about the enterotypes, it is that in rats, they have transferred fecal material to rats that have no immune system or no biota, and they've found that they can actually make rats fat or thin based on the fecal transfer. And that when we have a certain type of gut bacteria, we are more likely to put on weight given the same amount of calories. We know that nutrient delivery is important. We know that it influences stress, anxiety, mood, behavior, and neurotransmitters, many of which are involved in mood, stress, and behavior. Okay, so after that sort of basic picture that's compelling, diet is what we're going to focus on here, and that is food and its relationship to the gut microbiota. We know that it is absolutely crucial. It's one of the major things that we do change and can look at. It is a major factor in many of these things, and it communicates through our brain, through our metabolic functions, and through alterations in our intestinal environment. So this is just a slide that characterizes that. It is also a primary defense against pathogens. When we have dysbiosis or a dysregulated gut biota, we run into many, many problems, diseases, conditions. So they play a role in immune system, nutrition, metabolism, the structure and function of the gastrointestinal tract, and the number of processes. Leaky gut syndrome is one example. When you have gut dysregulation, that leaky gut, the mucus is not intact and they're not communicating well, and that leads to irritable bowel syndrome and other types of problems with the gut. So dysbiosis is a general term for dysregulation of our gut. And almost all of you have probably been on antibiotics in the past few years even. Antibiotics is a major factor that causes a temporary dysregulation of our gut, as well as all of the other biota, human biota. So it basically dysregulates us. Hence, they'll sell you lots of pills to try and replace some of those things. Not a bad idea, but I would prefer that we look at the foods we eat, because it is a much better way if we look at good foods for our gut. All right, so dysbiosis is a term for microbial imbalance or maladaptation. And gut dysbiosis is where they are looking for the immune system, the obesity-related, energy regulation, hormone regulation, and perhaps most important for our chronic disease burden, pro-inflammatory mechanisms. So inflammation is now the major contributor to all of our chronic diseases. Virtually all of our chronic diseases. So inflammatory processes and gut are very closely linked. Examples. When we have a long period of stress, our enteric nervous system or our gut-brain axis changes. and makes this mucosa more permeable, and that's that leaky gut kind of thing. And it just dysregulates the whole communication pathways, both for the sensory motor functions, fatigue perhaps, but also for other kinds of issues with functional GI disorders. So it's not surprising when you're really stressed that you are going to have maybe diarrhea, maybe constipation, or you might notice symptoms of your gut being dysregulated. And aging is another process whereby our systems are not quite as tight, and the systems are aging as we are aging. And chronic inflammation is much more likely as we age. So we have the same kind of thing with permeability of the gut, this dysbiosis. Our biota is not doing the job at their maximum level, and we have inflammation processes happening. I'm not trying to say that it's the only process, because obviously there are biological and genetic predispositions and many other things that impact aging or stress and inflammation. But it is a big part of the puzzle that's being teased out. So part of this big puzzle is that we're focusing on diet, but obviously every drug you take most of the drugs you take are affecting your gut if you're taking them via pill or oral form. Where you live, the water you drink. And actually my colleague, Dr. Zeman, made me put this in here. She looked over the slides because that is her area of expertise. And even though there's not a lot of literature out there yet, some of her research on nitrates in water at lower levels and how it affects health and arthritis and inflammation is pretty groundbreaking. So you're going to see a lot more of that. So we have life cycle stages in aging. We know that breastfeeding is best for the baby's microbiome. And we know that vaginal birth is baby's first exposure to the external microbiome. In some countries, they are actually, if there's a C-section that is absolutely necessary, they are swabbing the baby with mom's vaginal fluids to establish the gut microbiome for the baby. We're not there yet. I'm not sure what the barriers are on that, but if C-section infants have different microbial communities than vaginally birthed babies. They do catch up, but there's some hints that autism and some other factors may be at higher risk for C-section births. Okay, so when we've got all of these interactions and the systems level approach to all the different things going on in and on our body, what we need to maybe center in on or understand that we cannot change all of the different conditions. There are experts looking at tailoring the probiotic formulas for specific populations and specific, characterizations. But from our perspective, the gut is there to help us with our systems. And a lot of these things we're talking about are short chain fatty acids and bile acids, which are acids in our stomach secreted. So here's a couple of snapshots looking at some of these. Therapeutic value of intestinal short chain fatty acids in gut inflammation and obesity. So this is sort of typical of some of the narrower slices that you can get at through research. All right, so beyond the scope, medication, antibiotics, and all those interactions clearly have an effect. We have not just the medications we take, but we have the medications in our water. We have the medications in our food. So our country uses antibiotics to fatten up most of our calves and most of our pork. And yes, they are in the meat we eat, which may be one of the reasons why carnivorous diets are looking not so healthy for us. And that the whys may not be known, but the fact that it is not great for our gut microbiota is fairly well known. So we know that they use this to fatten up the calves and the pigs. They also tend to have an obesogenic effect on humans. So if you are on long-term antibiotics, there is an issue related to weight and metabolism shifts. This is not everyone, but this has been found in the literature, and people have different responses to antibiotics. So now we're getting to the heart of the matter, which is how do we feed our gut? So how do we tend our garden? And we're just going to focus on the 4 mechanisms that most experts are looking at to alter our gut biota. And that is fecal transplantation, prebiotics, probiotics, and postbiotics. So we eat protein, fat, carbs, lots of antioxidants, polyphenols, and contained in the foodstuffs that we eat, there are lots of pre and probiotics depending on our diet. The changes from a meal, if we have a triple bacon cheeseburger value meal, within 24 hours, our gut transforms. The biota in our gut starts saying, look what we've got here. And while we may always have certain types of bacteria, we are feeding those bacteria in favor of the other bacteria, that Probotella species and other species that may help us more in the long run. So the host disease factor of cardiovascular disease, diabetes mellitus, obesity, metabolic syndrome, and autoimmune diseases are affected by what we eat. And the metabolites, those are the measurable metabolic products that you can measure that after that triple bacon cheeseburger meal, you're going to have more inflammatory metabolites in your body. So you might have a flare-up if you have arthritis. You might have, if you have already autoimmune type diseases. Hence, you can go online and you can go on Amazon and find lots of books about anti-inflammatory diets, and most of them have the same core ideas that we're going to cover here, which is fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, bottom line. Now, the fecal microbiota transplantation is basically poop transfer. It is just poop transfer. And they're doing it at Mayo Clinic, they're doing it at Cleveland Clinic. Every major medical center will do it for certain conditions. We know that C. diff is an infection that is incredibly hard to kill and is potentially deadly. It is often hospital acquired, and that it is cured after years and years of trying to figure out how to fix it. Fecal transplantation can fix it. Probiotics are live microorganisms, and that would be your yogurts, your bifidobacterium lactobacillus, and within those there are many, many other strains of these type of bacteria which may have different effects. So the yogurt or the fermented foods have to have live microorganisms. It doesn't help if they're dead. So live cultures on your yogurt package, and you've got some live probiotics. Prebiotics, we haven't heard quite as much about, but we're starting to. It's starting to now be labeled and marketed as symbiotics. You can now buy a pill, more expensive pill, but it has prebiotics in it, which is basically fiber. Certain kinds of fiber, but it is roughage fiber. It is plant-based foods, and you are much better off eating the foods than taking the pills, as far as we know, unless you have a specific condition. So non-digestible carbohydrates, this is literally food for our microbiome. You'll see terms like oligosaccharides, short polysaccharides, inulin, oligofructose, galactofructose. All of these are names for different types of carbohydrates and yes, even sugars that our gut feeds on and needs because they ferment what we feed them and turn them into many, many good things, including some vitamins and minerals. All right, we're at 12:35. So this is a review of the literature from 2017 that looks at gut microbiota modulation and the relationship to obesity using pre and probiotics. The conclusion with the green arrow is that again, it's complicated. The microbial community is directly linked to obesity, and it's still unknown exactly how that happens because of the complex nature of all of these interactions. So when grandma said, eat your roughage, you should listen to her. Therapeutic strategies for gut microbiota in inflammatory diseases. The majority of global population has experienced many of these factors, inflammatory disease, and this review is just looking at some of these insights, therapeutic strategies, and this is from 2016. So how do we feed our gut? We need to feed them foodstuffs that they can ferment and turn into substrates, energy. So we're feeding our critters. The fermentation supports growth of microbes, then produce short-chain fatty acids and gases. So part of the problem with fiber, beans, legumes, and some of these things is the byproduct of fermentation sometimes is gas. Short-chain fatty acids correlates with lower diet-induced obesity and reduced insulin resistance, so better control of blood sugar. I don't think it's crucial at this point unless you're working in the field with real dietary changes, but butyrate and acetate are the ones that are most in the literature. Butyrate being protective for colon cancer, really protective. And glucose in general, glucose and energy balance. Appetite regulation is, while many may be involved, acetate seems to be involved in fullness and satiety. So it might help with sometimes when we eat a meal and we're hungrier than we should be after we eat. This may be some of the communications with our gut biota. All right, so gut enterotypes, they are, because of this metagenomic ability to take snapshots of our gut, and that is a picture, the Prevotella, the Bacteroides, and the Ruminococca are the actual, what it looks like when you do a metagenomic study, more or less, and you're typing your bacterial gut. So several studies have come out and said that there are 3 major enterotypes across the world that, in spite of all the different geography and all the different diet and all the different living conditions, that you can kind of group most populations of human beings in terms of 3, or some say more recently, 2 major types. So the 2 types you'll read about or see is the Bacteroides type, and people are rolling in the Ruminococcus type into Bacteroides. So this is where you have ruminococcus actually is ruminant. It is gut mucus proteins and simple sugars. It is the idea that we have some rumination going on in our stomach like cows, in that we are producing these things. Prevotella is the bacteria that is associated with carnivorous diets, and this is across the world. They did some pretty strong population-based studies. So when you eat meat, you have more of a Prevotella enterotype. And this Frontiers of Cellular Infection article also talked about the fact that even short-term meat eating can increase the Prevotella in our diet. We don't know what that means yet, but we do know that our gut prefers the types of fiber and nutrients that we get through plants. The Bacteroides does anyway. So here's one article that diet rapidly and reproducibly alters the human gut microbiome, and that these short-term changes happen within days, 24 hours or so. When you have a meal, when you're feeling stressed and you really want that burger and fries, it's not helping your stress response. And if you can understand that the stress, your gut needs better nutrition, that might be one motivating factor. The other major theme besides enterotypes, as far as the picture of our gut, is high diversity. So yes, we always have the Prevotella types. We always have different types in our gut. We need to encourage just letting it do its own thing in the best way possible, which is not killing off all the good stuff with antibiotics whenever possible. So we need diversity. It seems to be protective. And increased diversity in our gut is associated with less inflammatory cytokines, less inflammatory interactions. So the specific biota of all of these things are being investigated, possibly with tremendous profit-making potential. And as practitioners, it is just be aware of who is selling what and how. The best way for most of us to enhance our gut is to eat well, resistant starches, and fiber. So resistant starches is a whole nother category really quickly. If your oatmeal, my son actually makes his oatmeal the night before. Overnight, that oatmeal turns into a resistant starch and gets better. So a lot of our carbohydrates, if you store it, cool it down, it changes how that carbohydrate interacts a little bit. So resistant starches is an interesting category. But we want a high fiber diet, and we want a high fruit and fiber diet when possible. So low fiber intakes reduce short chain fatty acids, and the short chain fatty acids are the primary energy fuels for our gut. Okay, so prebiotics we already went over. Probiotics, live microorganisms. Examples. Prebiotics, we can find them in anything. Your body can change them around, the fructo-oligosaccharides and some of the fruit sugars, and they can be made into prebiotics in our gut. So all of these foodstuffs, from whole grain breads to mushrooms, berries, fruits, to garlic, asparagus, flaxseed, and beans especially. Beans are low cost and really good prebiotics that are inexpensive. Probiotics. There's lots of research on which subtypes are best for us, and there are all kinds of live probiotics that you can get. Almost every culture has fermented some beverage or fermented some milk, or basically sauerkraut, fermented vegetables, or kimchi. Every culture at its roots had some type of fermentation process, initially to preserve the foods, but the unintended consequence perhaps is that it also really fosters a healthy gut microbiome. So sauerkraut, fine. Fermentation. And no, beer doesn't count, I'm sorry, but beer is not a fermented, it doesn't work the same way in our gut and may not be great. I'm not sure about hard cider. Hard cider has some fermentation going on, and I actually don't know the science if that is good for us or not, but interesting. So probiotic foods, prebiotic foods, this is where we can take anybody's diet and recommend fermented foods, probiotics, and fiber-rich foods or prebiotics. Yes, thank you. So we are at our summary points. So our standard American diet, sad, is not optimal for the health of our microbiome or our overall health with chronic diseases specifically. And again, I'm just sort of the in-between conduit trying to translate some of this information into usable chunks that we can apply in the field. And you folks are the appliers. So the education and promotion of health towards whole food fiber and resistant starch foods, fruits, vegetables is needed for everyone at every level. And no, I don't think our government is going to put forward $1 billion to do this. And the way we're cutting out food stamps, and it becomes increasingly challenging for those of you trying to help people who don't have the resources, who don't have the education. This is a whole nother topic that is crucially important, and that is we are a food insecure country, and we don't have the availability of these foodstuffs for many people in many areas, especially in our cities, and yes, even in our rural environments. So my point is to be cautious and careful. We are not prescribing for diseases or conditions. And unless you have advanced degrees or you have a clinical dietitian or somebody else, don't prescribe foods. There is some effort to try and do that in an organized and professional way, but what we can do is to recommend foods in general that are good for certain populations. And your expertise comes with knowing your population and finding out. When we have the food cart, we were able to introduce foods that were low cost and healthy just by taste testing, right? Just by saying, try it, you'll like it. And lo and behold, some of them did. So most physicians and RNs are not given extensive or even minimal nutrition education unless they go further. And the final point, functional food therapies and practitioners. If you go to California or the East Coast, there are specialties associated with high-end medical institutions that will characterize your gut and do some of these studies and measure some of the metabolites and prescribe diet for specific conditions, specifically irritable bowel syndrome, celiac disease, and other kinds of specific gut conditions. So functional food therapies are on the horizon, and they will be happening. Also keep in mind the supplement industry is very loosely regulated, and the quality of what is in there is not often tested. So go after supplement industry with a lot of caution. So now is the time for questions, discussion, points from your perspective. And I don't know if we have them, but Farah is going to come up and let's see. So we have